And this is where we get into spending an hour, hour and a half talking about these issues, and more importantly, how do we apply it in our own teaching setting. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, go to the EII website and we'll have more details there, or you can catch Tasha or I for that. So let me turn it back over to Dr. Chu, and I'm glad to see some students stayed, and he'll be glad to answer questions. I also fed him some questions that folks who weren't going to be able to make it in terms of, tell me about this study method. What do you think about this? How do I study for OSCEs or boards and things like that? And so he'll have some opinions on that as well. Let me correct that. He will not just have opinions, he will be providing the evidence that supports or unsupports those beliefs. Unsupports.
Is this,
yep.
All right, testing. All right. Well, thank you for staying. Ralph and I had a bet that by this time no one would be here, but I appreciate those of you who've stayed on and those of you who have come for the afternoon session. Just out of curiosity, how many of you attended one of the first two talks today? All right, and then how many of you are this is the first talk that you've heard? All right. So I've got kind of a mix, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to review some of the material I talked about earlier that's relevant to this topic. This is going to be more of a student-oriented topic about how to learn. It'll also still be very useful to faculty, and I'll give you some information about how to help your students to learn the material. And then I'm going to do one of the demonstrations that I intended to do actually in the grand rounds this morning and ran out of time to do because I think it'll be relevant to you. So the title is How to Study Long and Hard and Still Fail. And the implication here is that it's possible to do that you can be motivated, you can spend the time, you can really dearly want to learn, and you can still fail. Okay? Because learning is not a matter of just simply spending the time and making the effort. It's using proper learning strategies. And in order to learn, you've got to understand what effective learning strategies are and what ineffective learning strategies are. The research is quite clear that the study strategies that students prefer to use the most are actually among the least effective in terms of actual learning. And we're going to go into that, but basically what we're going to find is that when you're learning, it doesn't feel like you're learning. And when you're actually feel like you're learning, oftentimes you're not. All right, so we're going to talk about that a bit. I'm going to go through some of these. I'm just going to kind of explain them very briefly. But if you want more information, I have a video series on YouTube about how to study effectively. If you need more information, then you're welcome to take a look at those. Like I say, they're free and they're available on YouTube. They're used quite widely. It's actually at least one other medical school I know uses them as part of their program of helping their first-year medical students orient to medical school. So it's a series of 6 videos, one introductory video, which is optional, and then 5 videos on sort of different aspects of studying effectively. So if you want to learn more about any information, first of all, I'll be around and I'll be happy to talk to you. And secondly, you can take a look at this series. Okay. So basically, students have a mental model of how they learn. Okay, they will structure their time. They will use the learning strategies that they believe are most effective for them. They will start studying at a time where they think they have sufficient time to study. Right? To the extent that their model is correct, they will actually be effective learners. But if their model of how they learn best is incorrect, if it has misconceptions, if it has gaps, it's actually going to undermine their learning effectiveness, and they may actually be capable of succeeding in college or succeeding in medical school, but they may actually not be successful and not complete medical school or college because of their poor study strategies. So that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. Most students, as I say, actually base their study strategies on untested assumptions and misconceptions. And what I try to do with my video series is to correct those misconceptions to help you become better, more effective learners. Okay, now I'm going to kind of talk about this in terms of student academic mindset. Okay, mindset is basically your overall attitudes. and beliefs and expectations concerning learning in the whole academic context. All right, so this is your whole attitude towards learning and how you approach your courses. One of the sessions I thought was really intriguing, the breakout sessions on how people learn, just showed that there's very different mindsets between the faculty and the students in terms of what the goal of medical education is all about. So I thought that was really an intriguing discussion. Okay? So let's start just with an overview of the cognitive challenges for teaching and learning. Okay? I'm a cognitive psychologist, and this is a list of all the different challenges that teachers and learners face in terms of accomplishing effective learning. Okay, student mental mindset, we're going to talk about growth versus fixed mindset. There's a variety of other mindsets that we can talk about. Metacognition. Metacognition is your awareness of your own level of understanding. Students often come in with a very poor metacognitive mindset. They don't really know, they're not really good judges of their level of mastery. Okay, student fear and mistrust. They think that the teachers are there simply to, to weed them out, to weed out the weak ones, and that they're kind of, intending to like cull out like a certain percentage of the class, versus a high trusting situation where the students believe that the teachers there, they want them to succeed, to help them succeed. And so if that trust is not there, the students are not going to be as motivated to learn. If that trust is there, the students will work harder and persevere longer to succeed. Okay? Prior knowledge. So students vary tremendously in the amount of prior knowledge they bring to class, and the more you know, the easier it is to learn new information. It's actually hardest to learn when you don't know have any background knowledge at all. Okay, misconceptions. These are the common beliefs and misconceptions students bring with them into the classroom. They pick them up from the media or common sort of common quote unquote common sense, which is actually not correct. These misconceptions are incredibly difficult to correct. Actually, the research is quite bleak in terms of your ability to correct these misconceptions. I talked about learning styles, the idea of like kinesthetic and auditory and sort of verbal learning. And there's absolutely no evidence for learning styles, but we call it the zombie myth because it just refuses to die. Okay. Ineffective learning strategies. We're going to talk about effective versus ineffective learning strategies. Transfer of learning. Virtually all new knowledge is context dependent. Students learn it in a class and they think it's only true for that class at that time. And they don't actually transfer that knowledge to other contexts. Most students actually would not be surprised if one teacher told them one thing, another teacher told them something completely different, because they only think that knowledge is true, for that class, and they only need to know it until they use it on the exam. Then they never have to think about it again. Okay. Then constraints on selective attention. We're going to talk about multitasking. And then constraints on mental effort and working memory. So this is like the amount of concentration and mental effort that you have. That's actually one of the main constraints of the cognitive system. So proper mental mindset actually addresses all the ones that are in red here. So if you have the proper mental mindset, you can actually overcome more than half of the constraints here. So it's really important as students to have a proper mental mindset, a proper set of beliefs, and it's really important as teachers to nurture and create a climate that promotes an appropriate mental mindset. Okay. Now, the current status of mental mindset is pretty bad. This is a survey of both professors and students of first-year college students, looking at their level of preparedness. So if you ask them what percentage of students do you think have gaps in their college preparation, the instructors at four-year colleges say that there's about 88% that are lacking. Okay, instructors at two-year colleges say 96%, almost 100% of the students have some sort of significant gap that's undermining their performance. And students themselves, almost half of them report that they aren't ready for college, right? And that's even before they started college, all right? So obviously, we need to work on this mental mindset. Now, here are four of the most common misconceptions that students have. that undermine their teaching performance. So you should really think about your level of belief in them. Learning is fast. First of all, students grossly underestimate the amount of time it takes for them to learn. They think that oftentimes, one good reading might be enough, or, if I can skim this is as good as reading it thoroughly. If I just memorize this fact, as good as understanding kind of the connection of knowledge, connection of facts, that's the whole context in which this fact is relevant. Okay, knowledge is composed of isolated facts. Oftentimes, students like to use note cards to study. Note cards can be effective if they're used properly, but note cards make it easy to study badly. When you study badly with note cards, what happens is you study the fact on each note card as if they're isolated facts. Okay, and this is one of the most robust findings, is that when you look at information as being composed of isolated facts, then you almost always have a bad academic outcome. You need to study information in a connected way to make sure you know how this fact is related to other facts and related to other categories. So using note cards is easy, but it's not necessarily effective. It makes it easy to study badly. I'll talk about alternatives to note cards. If you do use note cards, be sure that you make them an elaborated note card that has not just the information you need, but also the related concepts, the overall category, and maybe an example of that category. And that way the note cards will be more effective. Okay, being good at a subject is a matter of inborn talent rather than hard work. This is what's called fixed versus growth mindset. Let me see if I've got, this is the work of Carol Dweck. Students will have one of two mindsets. They'll either believe that they are born with certain levels of talent, and this talent cannot be changed. So this is a fixed mindset that I'm either born being a good writer, or a good physician, or a good caring health professional, or I'm not. And so there's nothing that can change that, as opposed to a growth mindset which says that my ability is a direct result of how hard I try and the effort that I put out. And there's a number of studies that Dweck has done which show that a fixed mindset can be really limiting in terms of your academic growth. So here's some examples of this. When you're faced challenges, if you have a fixed mindset, you avoid those challenges. You don't want to take on difficult tasks, or you don't want to pursue areas that you feel like you're weak in, because if you fail at them, then there's no alternative. There's nothing you can do. So you feel helpless. So you avoid potential risky kinds of classes or potentially risky kinds of career paths. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, you embrace them, because this is an opportunity to overcome a deficit and to improve yourself. Okay, obstacles, you give up easily. If you have a fixed mindset, you persist with going through obstacles because you believe that your effort can overcome those obstacles. Okay, and you can see, tasks requiring effort. If you have a growth mindset, you see that as a path to mastery. Criticism, if you have a fixed mindset, you take criticism personally. You ignore it, you try to avoid it, you deny it, and when you have a growth mindset, you learn from it. Okay, and the success of others. So if there are other people who are doing better than you in class, if you have a fixed mindset, that's very threatening to you, that there are people who are better than me, and then there's nothing I can do about it. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, it gives you a role model, someone that you can emulate and try to match. Okay, so that fixed versus growth mindset is very important. Yes?
Is that different or the same as nature versus nurture?
No, it's, you can see it kind of mapped into nature. The question is is it similar to nature versus nurture? It is kind of similar in the sense that nature, would be like that inborn talent. So it's like determinism, I think of it more like predeterminism versus determinism. So predeterminism is when you're born and it's unchangeable. Determinism is where you actually have efficacy over changing it. But yeah, it's a very similar idea.
Dr. Chu, could I comment on that as well? Because you had mentioned this earlier, and I've been reflecting on that. And I think about the students that move from high school, likely at the top of their class, way up there, moving into college, and to get into, upper levels of nursing, medical schools, allied health, they need to be again towards the top of their class in college. And so I could see how it would be easy to develop this mindset that I'm smart, things come to me, and then you hit day one, week one of, for example, medical school, and all of a sudden it's not easy or it's not coming to me, and there's this sort of, I'm an imposter. I've had, students say, I don't know if I belong here. These people are smart. They asking questions I don't know. And the same thing I think happens again, I've seen it in residency, the interns. That first month, they're like, I don't think I belong here. So I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but I think these transition points really challenge that mindset.
Yeah, it's especially difficult, the first failure experience. Actually, a lot of times you're better off failing early than failing late. Getting over that kind of failure experience, learning how to cope with failure and setbacks. So the farther up you get, the tougher it is. But hopefully you'll fail in a supportive atmosphere where you'll learn that, and you learn from your teachers, and you learn from upperclassmen how they've, it's easy to think no one has ever failed. Failure is kind of idiosyncratic. No one has ever failed like this before, when of course many students have. So you really need to learn to have a constructive response to failure, and it's very hard to do that if you have that fixed mindset. So a growth mindset kind of failure is really, reaction to failure is really helpful. And I'll talk more about actually that whole imposter syndrome thing a little bit later if we have time.
One thing I might add is that the dental college was recognizing this, that when their students were getting into the clinical years, they were really struggling with any kind of negative feedback. And so in the first week of orientation, they started putting the students through exercises that they were purposely failing. They were using origami and things like that. An exercise, you got 5 minutes, here you got to do this exercise, and they were trying, and then they were failing, and then they were using that to demonstrate that is going to happen in your career here. You are going to fail, we're going to give you feedback, you're going to be able to try it again and again and succeed. And so they're beginning to see students a little more open to that critical feedback that they have to have.
Great.
So
that's great. That's anticipating what a lot of students will experience. Here's some examples that I've seen in my own work, my own teaching, of fixed versus growth mindset. So a fixed mindset, I'm not good at math or science or reading. I've always been a good writer. That's a fixed mindset, like I was born this way. And that's very reassuring as long as you're successful, but then the first failure experience you have, the first rejection you get, then it's all going to be tremendously threatening. A fixed mindset is very brittle, and it breaks very easily. And then I'm not smart enough to do this. Here's some examples of growth mindset. I teach statistics, and so I get a lot of math anxiety, and students say I'm not good at math, and I always say, no, what this means is you have to just spend extra time on math and keep up with it. And so I had a student year before last. So on her exam, she always wrote in the top, you can do it. So she was just sort of reassuring herself that she was able to do it. Down here, you really can't see this. But this is a student on the second exam, a student who failed the first exam. But she came and saw me, and she worked with other students, and she did really, really well. And at the end of her exam, she wrote this. It said, I studied hard, and she wrote down this. And I wrote, and it shows, because she did so much better. So we see these kinds of statements. We have to identify both in our students and ourselves, when is it a fixed mindset statement and when is it a growth mindset statement. So instead of saying I'm not smart enough to do this, say with the right effort and help, I'm capable of doing this. I just need to find the resources, I need to devote the time, and I can do it. So I have to work extra hard at this. I can't let myself fall behind. So I've got to put extra work in this sort of thing. So we really need to get ourselves in the right kind of mindset, or help our students get in the right mindset. So let's talk about attention, that fourth one, that I'm good at multitasking. Okay, we often think we're good at multitasking because we do it all the time, right? But we rarely stop and we rarely compare our performance multitasking to focusing on one task at a time. And when you do that, you find that students, or actually everyone, is actually much better at focusing on one task, on unitasking rather than multitasking. We are actually not built to multitask. Okay? As a matter of fact, multitasking is actually a misnomer. What you're really doing is shifting from one task to another as quickly as possible. You're still only focusing on one task. It's just you're trying to shift back and forth. And you can't do that. Okay? And you can't do that and learn. Multitasking slows you down like 3 or 4 times. Your learning is slower, your reaction time is slower, your judgments are worse when you try to multitask. Okay? So attention is like a small focus of awareness. So you can see a whole scene, but you can actually only focus on a small part of it. So there's a ton of stuff going around you that you're completely unaware of, and you think you've seen everything, but you really haven't. Okay, that's kind of the nature of attention. There's 2 aspects I wanted to go into that are really relevant to students. The first one is inattentional blindness. This happens when we are focused on one aspect of a situation and other things happen outside of it. We miss them completely, but we're unaware that we've missed them. Okay, so oftentimes this leads to false confidence, where you think you've seen everything or heard everything in a presentation, but actually you've missed a lot and you're completely unaware of it. Okay, so you don't know what you've missed. So this is my favorite picture of inattentional blindness. These are people out on a whale watching cruise off the coast of California, and they're all oriented over to the right, focused on looking for whales, and because of that they miss the whale that's behind them. Okay, so that's inattentional blindness. You can miss tremendous number of things outside of your awareness and be completely unaware of it. The second thing you need to be aware of is attentional blink. Whenever you shift your attention, it's not instantaneous. Shifting attention is slow and laborious. So if you're focusing on like studying a document or a textbook or a paper and you get distracted, it will actually take you 4 or 5 minutes to refocus your attention completely. So every distraction that you experience is 5 minutes lost. Okay, so that means 12 minutes or 12 distractions and you've wasted an entire hour of studying. That's all it takes. So 12 distractions. So every beep, buzz, vibration of your phone, not even your phone, someone else's phone, someone like, talking behind you, a person in front of you in class who's like shopping on Amazon rather than paying attention to the lecture. It's at least 5 minutes. Okay. This is research that shows this by Rosen. He had students learn short lists, and then at some point they had a text they either had to respond to or send, and as soon as they had the text, their learning dropped off about 25 to 30%, and it took 4 to 5 minutes for it to come back up. So every distraction is about 5 minutes lost. Okay. So when we try to multitask, you're actually simply making it harder for you to learn. Okay, so multitasking is self-defeating. You're increasing the amount of time it takes you to learn by 3 or 4 times. All right, so the math of that is that if you have a concept that takes you 30 minutes to learn, like say a section of a textbook or something, if you try to do it while you're distracted, if there's a lot of distractions going around, that 30 minutes turns into 90 minutes. It triples as a conservative estimate. Okay, if you can figure out how to study with full focus, you can actually get that learning done in 30 minutes. You'd actually have another hour of guilt-free time to go and do whatever you wanted to do. Right? So how do we go about doing that? Right? How do you focus? Well, all right. So there, just to review, there's no evidence that multitasking is effective as concentrating one task at a time. Right? So you've got to really focus completely. There's no such thing as a momentary distraction. Every distraction costs you minutes. Okay? And so those distractions really add up, and it causes you to waste a lot of time. And so if you worry about not having enough time to complete all of your work and your study, you should think about, what are my distractions and how can I minimize those? Okay. Now, some people have greater ability to focus than others. And when those people are studied, it's not like they have a greater internal trait of willpower. What they are good at doing is structuring their environment to minimize distractions. So they don't just simply study with their phone on the desk, where it might buzz or it might light up with an incoming text. They put their phone in the next room over, so it's simply out of sight, so it's not a temptation. Okay, they tend to use regular, paper books and paper readings, and not use like electronic resources where there's always a temptation to click and go look at YouTube for a while. So people with high willpower structure their environment to eliminate temptations. They create an environment, a place where there are the fewest possible distractions. And I've always thought it would be really good to have a study hall where you are required to check in your electronic devices at the door. So that way, you go and study there, and that way you are kind of willing yourself not to have it. If you have a roommate, you can make a deal with your roommate. Like, we will both put our phones away for the next hour, and I'll watch you and you watch me, and we'll make sure that we study, with full focus. Now, if you're having trouble with distractions, I suggest what are called intense study sessions. This is a very good method that comes out of LSU. So this is the way you can structure your studying. So you can set a goal. So I'm going to read this section of a chapter. So you set that goal. You decide what you want to accomplish. You study with focus for 30 to 50 minutes. You get rid of the devices and distractions. Okay, so you limit all distractions. You use deep processing to focus, 30 to 50 minutes. Then you reward yourself for 3 to 5 minutes. And you have to use a timer here because, the average Facebook visit's like 20 to 30 minutes. So it's easy to let that 3 to 5 minutes get away from you. So you really need to be very disciplined about that. And then you go back and you review. So you go over what you just studied, or you try and summarize it to yourself, right? So each one takes roughly an hour. And so you can just structure your day using these intensive study sessions. All right, so that's a way of kind of trying to minimize the number of distractions that you have. Okay? All right. Now let's talk about metacognition here, because it's incredibly important for becoming an effective student. Metacognition for students is your understanding of how well you, or your awareness of how well you understand a topic. Okay, and this distinguishes between stronger and weaker students. Stronger students have an excellent sense of metacognition where they know when they have mastered material, and they know when they can stop studying because they have mastered that material. Weaker students have an inflated sense of understanding. They're overconfident. Okay, so they think they've mastered materials, they stop studying, when in fact they've stopped prematurely. They don't have a deep understanding. Their understanding is full of gaps, and it's really superficial. Okay, so I teach at a traditional college, and one of the problems that we've got is that students have gone through high school and developed a sense of metacognitive awareness that is appropriate for them, and then they come into college and it's completely inappropriate. And I imagine the same thing happens in medical schools, where they have a metacognitive awareness that's been very functional for them as undergraduates, and then all of a sudden it's completely inappropriate for medical school or graduate study or whatever program that they're in. Okay, so what happens then is with a student of poor metacognition is, first of all, they wait too late to start studying, right? So that means that they run out of time. And secondly, they stop too early, right? So they are simply fooling themselves into believing that they are ready when really they're not. And the hallmark of bad study strategies is that they increase confidence without actually increasing learning. So a bad study strategy gives you bad metacognition. Right? So you've always got to be wary of the effectiveness of your study strategies, because bad study strategies simply make you overconfident without actually helping your learning. Okay, all right. I'm going to skip over this. Okay. All right. Any questions at this point that I've kind of been moving through this pretty quickly. I don't want to go too fast, especially if we had the discussion, the epic rap battle about going too fast. So, yes.
One of the things that we commonly see is the student that always says, "I'm really bad at standardized testing."
Mm-hmm.
Is somebody really bad at standardized testing? Because most of the time I find that they're just not having a complete knowledge base. when you take them away from the standardized test?
That's a really good question. I mean, are people naturally good at standardized testing? Actually, no. Standardized testing is a very artificial kind of an activity to do, because and I've had this experience with my son, who's gone through this, where I've had to train him, not to use outside knowledge when answering these questions. They read the passage, he goes, but that's not true. I read this thing. It's like, no, you have to limit yourself. Don't think this thing through. So it is kind of an artificial kind of a task, but they've done standardized tests like every year of their life since 4th grade, so they should sort of know what those standardized questions are like. So I don't, I understand that people are disadvantaged, and the people actually that are most disadvantaged are non-native English speakers. Now that's a real issue, I think. But people who've been taking them, by the time they get to you, they should have done well enough on standardized tests to have gotten that far, I would say. One thing you can do, though, when we get to formative assessments, is actually to use examples of some old standardized test questions to help them to prepare. So think about that when I want to do this formative assessment activity. So that might be something you might be able to use. Think about that when we get there. Yes?
You mentioned earlier that failing early is not so bad. What about a student that fails early and often? When and how do you intervene, and what programs and support networks should be in place to identify that situation and overcome it?
That's a really good question, and there's actually a lot of really intriguing research on that. Not at the medical school level. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that, but at the college level there is. First of all, that's the reason I made these videos. The last video is called "I Blew the Exam. Now What?" So it is really meant to help those students who are just for the first time in their lives kind of face failure. But there's work now that kind of tries to anticipate this. And this is, like I say, at the undergraduate level. You have a percentage of students who come out of high school where they could actually skip a large number of classes and they'd be okay. You can't do that in college, because in college you have less than 1/4 the number of classes you have in high school, and the expectations are higher. So what several research projects have found is that you just identify students who, in the first week or two, that have missed 1 or 2 classes, and you send them a text or an email saying, I noticed you haven't been in class, is there something wrong? And a lot of times they didn't realize they were supposed to go to class right away. They thought that, we'll just wait a week or two, wait for it to ramp up, and then start going to class. Okay, and so, that kind of helps to kind of sort of counteract that. But then you have, a number of other interventions, and actually the videos I have are helpful in that. And if I have time, I'll get to something called exam wrappers, which use my videos, and that's another way of taking students who have failed and walking them through why they failed, and then changing their behavior to have greater success later on. So hopefully I'll get to that as well. So there are some good interventions for that. Yes?
If there was one thing I could add to at least in the medical school curriculum, it would be a mindfulness component that runs through the whole year. Mm-hmm. Having people be able to recognize where their thoughts are going and coming back to center. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if there's anything in the literature about, you mentioned that inattention, how it goes away for a few mm-hmm. minutes. Well, in a lot of clinical practice, the pager will go off. There will be an interruption by the nurse, or there will be a resident who says, I got this in room. So those aren't going away. Yeah. So I think we do need to train professionals how to more quickly come back, because mm-hmm. those aren't going away.
I think, mindfulness training is very big right now in education. And part of it is just monitoring, am I fully focused on this or not? And so when you have critical decisions to make, you really want to make sure that you're fully focused on it. And I mentioned this earlier, but just this last week, there was a paper that came out showing that when you make a mistake, you go through an attentional blink. So you make a mistake, and all of a sudden you're in this refractory period where you're just kind of trying to cope with that mistake. And oftentimes you try to act too quickly to correct the mistake, and you end up making the mistake worse. So you're more likely to make a mistake right after you've made an initial mistake. So when you make an initial mistake, you actually have to stop, think it through, and make sure that you are clear before you actually make your next decision. So that's really critical to monitor your own level of distractedness. And so make sure that when you are making critical decisions, you are fully focused on that decision. Okay. So, all right. This graph shows that people are poor judges of their own learning. Okay. This is by Bjork, who does a lot of great research on learning. So he looks at learning strategies that we know are effective. So interleaving is one. Interleaving is where instead of studying like all of chemistry here and all of microbiology, you study chemistry, then microbiology, then chemistry, then microbiology. You actually go back and forth. And that interleaving is more difficult to do, but actually that leads to better long-term learning. Okay, but it doesn't feel like it leads to long-term learning. Spacing is another case where instead of studying everything together, you actually space out your studying. So you have an exam coming up, you start like a week and a half in advance, you start doing a little chunk every day, and it leads to, instead of like 6 hours the day or two before, and it leads to better long-term learning. Okay, the red lines here are the actual performance. Okay, and so you can see that interleaving, which is this condition, leads to much better learning than blocking the practice. And spacing learning leads to much better learning than mass practice. The blue line is what the subjects predicted that they would do, how the subjects predicted they would do. This is their predictions of how much they would learn. You'll see in virtually every case, the judgments of learning are completely opposite of the actual learning. We are bad at judging our own learning. Okay, because when you're learning, it actually doesn't feel like you're learning anything, and when you feel like you're learning, oftentimes you're not learning. Okay, it's one of those strange kinds of things, but learning actually occurs when it's difficult and it's hard, and you really have a lot of uncertainty. That's actually the sign of more effective learning. So we're not good judges of our own level of learning. So the moral of that story is never judge your learning by the number of hours you studied or your feeling that you are prepared. The only way to judge your learning is by testing yourself in a meaningful way. So, keep a set of problems unsolved from a unit you are studying, and then, when you think you're ready, go do that set of problems. And see how well you do. And that will tell you actual, better feedback while you're prepared. A good professor will provide those opportunities for self-test and allow you to judge before the exam whether you're really prepared or not. But you can't trust your feeling. And the most common, complaint of students is like, study for hours on this. Hours don't matter. Okay, they don't necessarily correlate with how much you learn if you use bad study strategies. All right, so this is kind of the mistaken beliefs that students have about learning. Okay, so they tend to prefer easy methods because they can get a lot of studying in. So mindlessly reading material, mindlessly writing out and memorizing note cards, mindlessly rewriting their notes. So I write out my notes again as if that will help me. So these are things that can make you look busy. But they're really low effort, and they're not really engaging you in a significant way. Okay, students tend to assume that all study strategies are effective when they're really not. Okay, so let's see. Okay, yeah. So these beliefs are wrong. That all study strategies are effective. That's not correct. The amount of study is the key to learning. Okay, that's not correct either. You do have to put in the time. But you have to put in the time with effective study strategies. All right, so let's talk about what those effective study strategies might be. A good sort of approach to this is called levels of processing, which looks at study strategies in terms of their depth of processing. Okay, a poor study strategy has a shallow level of processing. It focuses on mindless, easy, repetitive practice. right? It doesn't force you to think meaningfully about anything. And shallow study strategies are not going to lead to better learning. So you can spend hours and hours using poor study strategies, shallow study strategies, and you're not going to learn anything. Okay, what you need to use are deep processing strategies which focus on subjective meaning. Okay, so deep strategies have you relate the meaning to prior knowledge, or relate the meaning of certain concepts to other related concepts. I'm going to skip through this. Okay, all right. So here are 4 properties, and this is in your handout, that you can think about that will help you to identify when you're studying deeply. Okay, so are you elaborating on concepts? So as you read, are you thinking, this reminds me of something else I read, or we have covered something that was similar to this, or this seems to be an extension of this other idea, right? So making those connections with other concepts. Distinctiveness, okay? You're going to learn a bunch of very similar concepts, and you need to really focus on what distinguishes one concept from another. And a good professor will really highlight those distinctive concepts, or the distinctive properties of related concepts. Personal, can relate this to my own experience, and appropriate retrieval and application. One of the most effective study strategies that you can have is to close your book, close your notes, and just simply practice retrieving as much information as you can, especially if you can retrieve it in a certain way, in the same way that you're going to be tested over it. Okay, it is difficult, it's awkward, but actually there's not much better than that in terms of actually leading to long-term recall. Okay, so those are 4 properties that will help you to learn. Okay. So just to elaborate on that, I just said, write down what you can recall, explain it to a classmate or a friend, and then try to answer questions about it. Be sure and go back and check and see what you missed. Okay, that will give you some information about what you might have had. Now, if you want to learn for the long term, and which obviously if you want to use this knowledge for the long term, then you need to follow Nuttall's rule of 3. Nuttall is Graham Nuttall. He was an educational psychologist in New Zealand, and he did extensive work looking at student study behaviors and long-term recall a year later. What he found was that students have to need to encounter on at least 3 different occasions the complete set of information needed to understand a concept. So you need a complete set of information on 3 separate occasions in which you can really study it deeply and comprehensively and sort of take it all in. Okay, it's got to be fully interpreted, fully integrated on each occasion. 3 separate occasions. That's a minimum. Okay, obviously if the information is difficult, it may take more than that, but minimum of 3 separate occasions. Okay, now coupling that with learning research, how does that come about? Okay, this is what you need to do. The best way to learn something is to learn it, then forget it, then relearn it. Okay, so you want to give yourself time to forget the information and relearn it. Okay, rather than block it all together and it's very sort of strong for a while, but it really fades out quickly. We have at Samford, we've got a January term that lasts 3 weeks, and so you're meeting 6 hours a day for 3 weeks, and so you learn that information very quickly, but you forget it very quickly also, right? So if you want to study information and learn it for the long term, learn it comprehensively, deep processing, then forget by either spacing out your practice or studying another subject, then relearn the material using deep processing, then allow yourself to forget, then relearn it by deep processing. Okay? So at least 3 times, and that will really go a great distance to helping you to learn the information. Okay, so I've got 3 minutes left, right? Okay, all right. So I'm not going to get to the demonstration. So okay, all right. So let's talk about note-taking for a minute. You can think of this in terms of depth of processing as well. Note-taking is not about writing down what the professor says or what is on the video. Okay, good note-taking does 3 things for you. Okay, first of all, it makes you pay attention and think about the material. Okay, it's a way of helping you to engage the material, helps you to process information at a deep level, determine what's critical. So you have to think it through as to what is important to write down. And third, it creates a personal set of retrieval cues for critical information. So it helps you to retrieve the information that you didn't write down. All right. The best set of notes probably only have about half the information that's presented. Okay, so if you only remembered what was written in your notes, then you'd probably fail all of your exams. Okay, so your notes basically are retrieval cues. Remember the parts of the presentation that you didn't write down. Okay, so that's the best way to think about notes. There's a lot of students who like to take notes on laptop. The problem with that is it lends itself to taking dictation rather than actually taking notes. The research shows that taking notes by hand is more effective for many students because it's so difficult and laborious. You actually have to think, is this worth writing down? And you have to make that judgment, and that judgment is deep processing, right? And so, that really helps you out. Now, that's if you have trouble taking notes. But if you actually know how to take notes effectively, then you can take notes, by any means that you want. But if you're struggling, one of the things that you might want to do is to switch to taking notes by hand. Okay, the same thing with highlighting. A lot of students highlight very poorly. They look at the textbook that's got a bolded term, and they go, oh, I'm going to highlight that term that's already bolded anyway. Okay, that's not what you want to do. You want to read through the text, decide, what do I need to know in terms of connected conceptual understanding, and then highlight that and then review it later. Okay, let me see here.
I think we're actually out of time.
Huh? I know.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to sort of end there, and I encourage you to take a look at some of the study videos that I have, and I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chu.